Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do a little bit deeper of a dive on constant depression carburetors. I've had more questions about these than pretty much any other subject, so we'll look at, I've got a Stromberg that's already taken apart, but SUs are really pretty similar. We'll talk about both of them. This video is going to be mostly about kind of how they work, what the different components do. I've got other videos set up for how to rebuild them, but this will hopefully help you to understand them a little bit better. So let's take a look. Regardless of which setup you've got on your car, they're both operating basically on the same principle. You've got fuel that's going to go into the float chamber on a Stromberg that's just on the bottom. Your throttle is going to open this up here, and that is going to introduce the vacuum from the engine down the throat of the carb. You're going to have air is going in here. It's going to force the piston upwards. You see the needle in there, that's what controls the fuel mixture, and it's going to atomize on its way to the engine. So the entire setup here, every piece that you see, is basically intended to get fuel and air mixed and going into the engine. That's all these things are designed to do. And what makes them a little bit different from your typical lawnmower carburetors, that in a car engine they need to operate at different RPMs. You're going to be stepping on the gas, you're going to need to accelerate, decelerate. None of these are things that you're going to need to do in a typical lawnmower. So it's a little bit different of a setup, but that's why you have a lot of the bolt-on kind of add-on features. That's the whole concept behind the dash pod. We're going to talk about that. But first, let's take a look at just the basic concept. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, how exactly does the fuel get into the engine? You'd be mistaken if you thought that it was just the pump. And the fuel pump's only job is to put fuel through this tube into the float chamber. But the float itself, and there's a needle valve inside, keep the fuel at a specific level, and it's really the vacuum of the engine. When you open the throttle plate by stepping on the gas pedal, you're introducing manifold vacuum into the chamber. That's going to raise the piston and it's going to draw fuel out. And to kind of conceptualize that a little bit, alright, so what we've got here is a vacuum gauge, and I've got compressed air to simulate the moving air through the carburetor. And what you're going to see is when I blow it past this tube, it's going to register a vacuum. Now the shape of the inside of the carburetor is going to be very important. How the air is moving through, what kind of a vacuum you get. You actually get more than that from manifold vacuum, but that gives you an idea. So you think to yourself, well, how does a vacuum really draw in fuel? Does that actually work? I've got a little demonstration I can show you here. With a cup of water and just a piece of vinyl tubing. And I'm going to do this to the side of the cup so that it's not just blowing water straight out, but what you're going to see, faster moving air creates a low pressure area. So there's lower pressure on one end of this tube than on the other, and so that's going to create a vacuum and it's going to draw the fuel up the tube. Watch. And that's basically it. In concept, that's what you're seeing. And the next thing you're going to need to do is to control the fuel. And easiest way to do that, well, there's two ways actually. Way number one is that you can control how far of a distance does the fuel, and we used water as an example, but how far of a distance does the fuel need to travel? If you have a shorter distance, you're going to get more fuel. It's going to be easier for the vacuum to draw it out. Longer distance, it's going to be obviously more difficult because it's a longer path. And that's why you have varying heights of fuel in the float chamber is going to play a role in your coarse mixture adjustment. The other thing that you're going to have is a metering needle, like this one. And you can control how much fuel is going in by controlling how big the hole is. So if you look very close to the needle, and you probably can't really see it from not on camera anyway, but it's tapered. It's thicker at the top than it is at the bottom. And the only part we really care about, the most important part anyway, is right at the top of the tube. So right here, at the wider area of the tube, you've got a smaller opening. As the needle goes and travels up, you've got a larger opening because the taper of the needle, it's narrower right here. So you've got more space to go around it. So the higher up the needle travels, the more space you have, the more fuel flow you can get. An SU is going to be very, very similar to a Stromberg, but I have a Stromberg taken apart. They're a little bit more complex, and so let's take a look at that one. I have one, like I said, taken apart here. This is the body of the carburetor. Okay, the air would go in through here. It's going to draw fuel up through the flow chamber. This is where the butterfly valve would be your throttle plate, and it's going to come out mixed together on that end. And you can kind of see you've got basically a tube, and a tube that's pinched in the middle. Remember, I said the shape is important. But anyway, let's take a look at what happens and kind of build this together. Fuel is going to go in through this pipe here. This is where fuel is introduced into the carburetor. That comes around to this hole here. So you don't want a constant supply of fuel, because remember, you want to try and keep it at a certain level. So how do we do that? Well, we've got a needle valve. And when the needle is down, it shuts off flow. When the needle is down, it allows fuel to flow in. When it's up, it just shuts off a valve. It's like the faucet on your sink. You basically shut it off when you raise that needle up. So this goes in the bottom there. Now you need to control the fuel going in. You've got the needle valve that shuts it off, but it's a little bit inconvenient to stand by the carburetor with your finger underneath controlling the flow of fuel. Also, it's kind of difficult to get your finger in there when the bowl's in the way. So instead, you need something to do that job for you. And here you have, as the name would imply, these floats, which will float conveniently, unless they're leaking. And now, when the floats get up to a predetermined level, it's going to shut off that needle valve, which will stop the flow of fuel going into the carb. That's what you want. So now you've got a very specific height of fuel. The fuel pump's going to put out a couple of PSI, and these floats, when they are up all the way, it's going to be enough to shut off the flow from that sort of fuel pump. So you might imagine, well, if you've got too much fuel pressure, these floats aren't going to work. You're right. And that's why if you've got some of the aftermarket fuel pumps might produce more than the, let's say, 2 or so PSI that you need, and it's not going to be able to shut off that valve. Fuel is going to then spill out, and that's a common thing that you might see. So sometimes it's the needle valve, sometimes it's too much fuel pressure. Now we need to set this correctly, and to do that there is a specification, and you want to measure the height of your float at the highest point. And you can see that this one is basically a little too far high, well, high this way. But it's supposed to be, in a TR6 anyway, I think it's 16 to 17 millimeters. Check the spec in the shop manual, this is already set. But you can see there's a little bit of a gap. And so what you need to do is kind of bend the tab down so that it rides a little higher, and then measure it again. And you want both sides to be right there. There's a millimeter of tolerance, and these are okay. If both sides, if you've got one side that's higher than the other, just kind of bend this metal bit here until you can get them both even. But once you're there, then you know that the flow of fuel is going to be at a very specific level. That's exactly what you want. This is the jet. Sometimes people will replace this. There is generally never a reason to. If it's damaged or corroded or just generally extremely bad, okay, pull it out. There is a special tool to put this back in. You have to buy that tool. You really can't just hammer it in, because you're going to damage the end of it. It's going to screw up the fuel flow. Generally speaking, if you're just rebuilding this because you've got running problems, first of all, it's probably not the carburetor. Pay attention to your distributor first. But if it is the carb, this isn't likely to be your problem. Unless the entire thing is going through a rebuild, you could generally ignore the jet. The needle's going to get replaced first. So anyway, that's that. And we need a gasket here. the bottom, but obviously you don't want a giant hole in the bottom of your carburetor, so that's what this plug is for. There's a few different versions of this. Float bowl I've got over here has just a simple plug that snaps in place. There's an O-ring that goes around it. Same concept, just an older design. And this O-ring always goes bad. In fact, if I scrape this with a screwdriver, that is basically hard plastic and it's not supposed to be. So let's replace that real quick. Make sure to poke your fingers while you're doing that. Yeah, look at that. That's awful. No chance of that sealing. Alright, I've got a new O-ring here. There we go. And if you've got the earlier design like this, just threads right into place. I like these threaded in ones, but if you have one of these stupid plastic caps, you can take it out, put in a new O-ring just for grins and giggles, but basically just use some epoxy, put it in. There is no reason that that piece needs to ever come out, and so it's really more of an afterthought from when these used to have adjustable jets. So if you've got a set of Zenith Stromberg carburetors, that's it. Just plug that up with some epoxy and a new gasket. You're good to go. Okay, so now you need to be able to control how much fuel. And for that, you've got your metering needle, which looks like this. Again, it's tapered, so you can probably see it on camera. It's a little bit narrow at the bottom than it is at the top. This is measured in parts of a thousandth of an inch. As you kind of go down, you can measure it at different spots, and you're going to get a different specification. Do not sand this down. You can clean it up maybe with a paper towel and some solvent, but do not sand it down. Don't use emery cloth on it. You're going to ruin the taper of the needle. And again, you've got very, very minute fractions of an inch between, let's say, here and here and here and here, and it will make a difference in the amount of fuel. So the other thing is on these needles right there, you can see, well, you probably can't, but I'll read it for you. It says B1AF. So this is a TR6 metering needle. And when it's set up in its housing, it's not really a housing, when it's set up in its carrier like this, if you pull down on the needle, you'll be able to read that out the bottom. So it's spring-loaded to kind of keep it in a proper position, but if you pull down on it, you should be able to see what needle is in there without having to disassemble this. If you do end up disassembling it, it's just a little piece of wire that is impossible to get from one end to the other here. We need this needle to be able to go in from the top. There's the jet, that's the top of the jet. So you'll see there's a little bit of a hole in there, right down in there. And that's what this needle needs to fit into. Now you can't, again, you're not going to be sitting here just metering it manually. So this has to fit into something. That we are going to use our, the screws in there. For that, we are going to use our air piston here. Little gap in the needle, little hole right there. Slots right in, and notice there's a groove here that needs to line up with the hole. So a little grub screw that goes in. The adjuster that goes in the other end. Now this also has an O-ring on it, and that O-ring tends to fail. All of the O-rings on these carburetors are great if you want to kill your finger with it. Alright, new O-ring. Here we go. This just goes right down the top. I like to push this down with my carburetor adjustment tool, kind of make sure that it goes straight. And then you're going to want to twist it anyway, because you need it to lock in with that needle. You should be able to screw the adjuster in and out and see the needle move up and down. There's one other piece that's very important here, which is this little star washer here. And that's actually intended to lock everything in place. So it needs to go down straight. You want to make sure that it's sitting flat. This one is not. Now it is. Make sure that it's flat and at the bottom, and what that's going to do is it's going to keep the adjuster from backing out. Okay, now this is where the constant depression carburetors are really cool. And it does not matter, this is a Stromberg, but if you have an SU, internally it's going to be exactly the same thing. You've got a jet, that's the jet in there, and you can see it kind of poking out through the top. And then you've got a needle that's going to go down into it. The main difference with the needle between the Stromberg and an SU is that in an SU, that needle needs to be centered. There's a special process to center the needle to make sure that it'll go up and down in the jet, because what you want is to be able to lift the piston when you're rebuilding it, drop it, and you should hear kind of a click. It doesn't have to be quite that strong, but it should drop with an audible click. If it doesn't, then you need to work on recentering the needle. So that's for a different time. I'll just reassemble this real quick so I don't lose any parts. The other difference between Stromberg and SU is that Strombergs, we use a diaphragm. So you've got this rubber gasket. On an SU, inside the dash pot, that air piston goes up and down, but it's really just a machined fit. In here, it will still go up and down inside the dash pot on the top, but instead of just relying on an excellent machine job, which over time is going to wear, it makes use of a gasket. So by the way, the gasket has a slot in it. There's a matching slot in here. It helps to make sure it's positioned the right way. Okay, now make sure the needle goes straight down into the jet. There is a spot on the diaphragm right here that's going to slot into a space on the carb body, and that's going to help ensure that the holes that allow the vacuum in are facing this direction, which is what you want. Alright, now from there, you don't want to rely solely on gravity to push this back down. There is a spring. It is specific to the type of car. Reminder, if I haven't said this before, these are Posi-Drive screws, not Phillips head. See a lot of these that are stripped, and that's the reason. It's the wrong type of driver being used. Okay, so now what you have, when the throttle opens, there's a vacuum that goes in See the two slots, one there, one there. That's a vacuum that goes into the suction chamber up here. When the throttle opens and the manifold vacuum increases, it will raise the piston, which raises the needle out of the jet. And remember, we said that the needle's tapered on the bottom, so you get a bigger opening, more fuel's allowed through. Obviously, because of the opening, more air is allowed through at the same time. When you let go of the pedal and you don't need quite as much, it drops back down. And that's what you're looking at there. So that, in principle, that is as simple as it is.